Hi everyone, and welcome to our video on controlling heart rate. This is part of our Module 5 Part 5 series looking at those plant and animal responses, and in this video we'll be having a look at specification reference 5.1.5k, the effects of hormones and nervous mechanisms on heart rate. First thing then, let's drop back to some basic principles about the heart and just remind ourselves about its purpose in the body. So the whole purpose of our heart is to pump blood around our circulatory system, and that means that we've got transport of various substances like oxygen, and also it allows us to distribute heat throughout the organism's body as well. Now, in order to actually meet the demands, which will continuously change, then we've got to have some kind of mechanism in place that allows us to then change the activity of the heart. And basically there are three ways that we can change this activity. First, we can alter the heart rate itself. Secondly, we can alter the force of contraction of those ventricular walls. And thirdly, we can alter the stroke volume. And it's not just a case of maybe one of those on their own, quite often it's various ones in conjunction with one another to bring about the change that we require. Quick reminder about two of these phrases that we should have learnt back in Module 3, heart rate and stroke volume. When we are talking about the heart rate, that is the number of beats per minute, whereas your stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped per beat. So what we're going to be very careful of is if we are actually calculating a stroke volume, clearly we need to be using volumes in that, so centimetres cubed, etc. One more phrase we should remind ourselves of from Module 3 is myogenic. Now, cardiac muscle is myogenic, and by that we mean that that muscle can actually initiate its own contraction. So it doesn't require external influence, it's actually able to cause its own contraction, and if we take your heart out of your body, it will actually continue to contract rhythmically for a short period of time anyway. Clearly, don't try that at home because removing your heart from your body is kind of a permanent thing, don't do it. When it comes to that contraction, when we're talking about the structure of the heart, remember, we've got those four chambers. So let's draw the super simple heart. There it is. And if we divide it up, we've got four chambers. So at the top are the atria and the bottom are going to be the ventricles. So what we actually find is that the muscle of the atria contracts at a higher rate than the ventricular muscle. So what we've got to have is coordination. If we don't have coordination, then what we're going to find is that the way the heart is contracting is all going to be out of sync with one another, and therefore it's going to be highly inefficient at pumping that blood around the body. And quite clearly that's going to create issues in terms of transporting substances, and that's not good for the overall survival chances of an organism. Do remember that phrase we use for that loss of synchronization? Fibrillation. And of course, Module 3 we had a look at a lot of things to do with issues to do with the heart and its lack of control. If we remember then the way that this all works, we've got our sinoatrial node, and remember you can get away with just the abbreviation SAN, and our sinoatrial node is located in the wall of the right atrium there. What happens is the sinoatrial node initiates that wave of excitation that travels through the walls of the atria. And remember, it's happening on both sides at the same time there. It's going to travel through the walls of the atria, and then it gets to the AV node, atrioventricular node. And from the atrioventricular node, which acts as a bit of a gatekeeper, it holds it for a moment, we're then going to transmit it down the septum through the Purkinje fibres. So those Purkinje fibres obviously run through the ventricular walls, and remember it causes that contraction starting at the very apex of the heart there and working its way back up. Now we've reminded ourselves of the basics of how our heart rate is controlled, what we need to understand is how we can modify that rate at which the heart is beating in those different scenarios that might require an increased heart rate. So our heart muscle actually responds directly to adrenaline. And hopefully we remember from the previous video that adrenaline is that fight or flight hormone. So in those periods of stress, we will release adrenaline, and then that's going to travel through our bloodstream, and one of those organs that it has its effect on is the heart. So what we see is if adrenaline is present, it then causes that heart muscle to increase the frequency of contraction. So we're increasing the frequency of that heartbeat. As we've mentioned, that resting heart rate set by the sinoatrial node, SAN, and just to remind you, that should have a frequency of somewhere between 60 and 80 waves per minute. So what we typically find is average heart rate when you're at rest, 60 to 80 beats per minute, or excitation waves per minute. Obviously, if we've got a period where we're going to have to fight or run away from danger, we're probably going to need a faster heart rate than that to be able to pump the blood faster to get it so that we've got more oxygen and glucose to the muscles, etc. So we've got in our brain the cardiovascular center located in the medulla oblongata, and that is able to alter the frequency of these waves of excitation. So obviously we've got adrenaline being able to directly affect the rate at which the heart is contracting, and we've got involvement of our brain through the medulla oblongata actually being able to utilize that cardiovascular center there to change the frequency of those waves as well. So the way it works then is that from the medulla oblongata, we've got nerves that then supply the sinoatrial node, and they're part of that autonomic nervous system. So remember, autonomic is the one that is kind of subconscious. So we've got two bits we need to remember here, and remember in our autonomic nervous system we subdivide further into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system part is something we call the accelerans nerve, and this is going to cause the release of a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. Now, if noradrenaline is present at the sinoatrial node, that's going to lead to an increase in heart rate. If, however, we've used the medulla oblongata and we're then sending those electrical impulses down the parasympathetic system, it's going to be the vagus nerve, and that causes the release of acetylcholine, another neurotransmitter. And the acetylcholine at the sinoatrial node will reduce heart rate. So what we can see here is we've got those antagonistic systems, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, one accelerating and one reducing heart rate. And the way they're doing that is through the release of different neurotransmitters. So accelerans is the sympathetic, increasing heart rate, think of it as accelerating heart rate there, and that uses noradrenaline. The vagus nerve, the parasympathetic one, reducing heart rate, and that's our acetylcholine. So let's think of some contexts where we're going to need to change heart rate then. One of the good examples of this is in something that hopefully you all do before some kind of physical activity, which is stretching. So before you run a race, what you should do is obviously carry out some basic stretches. Now, obviously people say it warms up your muscles. Well, actually what it's doing is it's getting your body ready for that running. Because what we're doing is when you're stretching, stretch receptors in your muscles detect that movement. And basically it's almost like your body is saying, hold on, we're about to run. Now, what that's going to do is send impulses to our cardiovascular center in the brain. And that basically tells the brain that extra oxygen could well be needed soon. These legs are starting to stretch, muscles are doing things they don't normally doing. Therefore, increase that heart rate just in case we need that extra oxygen. So through that action of stretching before a race, you're preparing your body by increasing the heart rate and therefore getting extra oxygen circulating in advance of you actually starting. We also have chemoreceptors. And if we think about a chemoreceptor, break that word down, chemo relating to chemicals, receptors, obviously cells that detect a change in a stimulus. So these are going to be those receptor cells detecting a change in a chemical. Now, in our carotid arteries, the aorta and the brain, what we find is that we've got these chemoreceptors that monitor the blood pH. The reason that's important is dropping back to some of the work we did in module 3, we talked about carbon dioxide transport. Now, what we said was that carbon dioxide is going to react with water to produce carbonic acid, and because obviously carbonic acid is an acid, we lower the pH. So what we're seeing there is that in those scenarios where we've got an increased amount of carbon dioxide in the body, the pH of the blood is going to decrease. And that will be detected by these chemoreceptors in those key locations, carotid arteries, aorta and brain. What that then does is it's going to detect that pH change, send action potentials to the cardiovascular centre in the brain, and that then will increase heart rate because we've got a surplus of a waste material we need to get rid of. Therefore, increasing heart rate is going to mean we get that blood with the carbon dioxide in it to the lungs for expiration quicker. Another example, when you have finished exercising, your carbon dioxide levels are going to decrease again because obviously after exercise, less respiration is occurring, therefore less carbon dioxide is being made. Because there's less carbon dioxide being made, that means we're going to have less carbonic acid, which means the pH of your blood is then going to increase. That will obviously be detected by those chemoreceptors, and that is then going to use the reduction in action potentials travelling down the accelerans nerve to reduce your heart rate. So those chemoreceptors are purely monitoring what's happening to your blood pH as a result of how much carbon dioxide is present, and that's all tied in to how much respiration is taking place. It is also worth mentioning that the stretch receptors have another location in your carotid sinus, and those stretch receptors are going to be monitoring your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too high, what's going to happen is we need to reduce the heart rate because high blood pressure is potentially dangerous to the organism. So anytime that high blood pressure is detected, action potentials are sent to that cardiovascular centre again to send that signal to reduce the heart rate. Because if we reduce heart rate, we reduce the blood pressure as well. So obviously we've got all of these different aspects feeding in so that our heart rate can be altered depending on the situation we find ourselves in, assuming it all works well. Obviously, we know not everything works perfectly in life. And if your heart loses its own ability to control its heart rate, then we need to put something else in to do it for it. And that's what we call an artificial pacemaker. Now, artificial pacemakers, you see one in the little picture on the left there, is basically a little electrical device. So we've got a little battery in there and then these long wires. And what they're going to do is they're going to insert the little device, obviously just under the skin here of the sort of chest wall basically. And then those wires, you can see, get fed down through your vein and into the heart itself. So the idea of those wires is that they're going to carry a regular electrical impulse from our little device to the heart muscle. And what that does is it's then going to basically take over from the SAN, and that means we've got that little pacemaker is telling the heart when to contract. But obviously it is artificial, and therefore it does require an element of surgery to insert it. As always, I hope you found this video useful, and don't forget to subscribe so you can see when the next video is uploaded, and of course head on over to the website where you can find a range of other resources to help you in your A-level biology studies.